Yep. My name is Tejas Shroff. I'm based out of Dallas, Texas area. I'm a Senior Director of Managed Security Services at NTT Data, primarily managing the identity and access management and application security practice. I'm also an adjunct professor at UT Dallas, where I teach various cybersecurity courses to graduate students at the School of Management. I'm also a board member of FBI affiliated North Texas chapter of InfraGuard. It's a non-profit which is a collaboration between FBI and the private sector. I also serve on advisory board for Collin College, a faculty sponsor for UTD Cybersecurity Club, and have been involved in a few other things. So, absolutely, it's a pleasure to talk to you guys about ZTNA. We already had our first series where we talked about ZTNA architecture, and we briefly touched upon how ZTNA differs from the legacy VPN. And if somebody has been following the news, even yesterday there was an incident where the legacy VPN was affected. So more and more signs are pointing that we need to move towards a zero trust network architecture. So these are some of the core principles of zero trust security, where you want to make sure that we are validating and verifying explicitly. Every user, device, and connection needs to be authenticated. Least privilege needs to be enforced. One of the biggest problems is in the world of access control, be it network access, be it identity access, that we end up granting more privileges to people, to non-human identities, more than what needs to be given. Because somebody wants to make their own job easier, say, okay, you keep on coming and asking for more access, I'll give it to you right now. But by giving that extra access, we are compromising the security in a big way. Another big thing which we always talk about in the world of zero trust security is you have to assume breach. You have to assume that you have been compromised or compromise is going to happen, and you design your environment so that if the compromise happens or when the compromise happens, you're prepared for it. So assume breach is a very strong characteristics that the networks and the architectures need to follow, and you need to make your systems resilient enough so that when you are assuming breach, you are making sure that anything and everything that happens, you have factored that in. So there is another concept called BAS, or breach and attack simulation, which a lot of companies do that to make sure that how ready they are to withstand breach. Obviously, deploying MFA is very much of the need of the hour, and now it's become almost of as a requirement rather than luxury. So you have to strengthen your access controls with MFA, and obviously you need to monitor your in a continuous manner. So a lot of times by doing these basic things, you are able to strengthen your security posture significantly. As mentioned in the previous session too, these are the 5 pillars of zero trust: identity, devices, networks, applications and workloads, and data. So each of these need to be strengthened to provide an end-to-end zero trust security. You have your identity, which needs to be completely followed. You need to have your devices, which need to be authenticated, so you're not coming in from unauthenticated device. Your network needs to be segmented and microsegmented, which we will touch upon going forward. Your applications and workloads, I think my next session will be on the ethical hacking with which will look into this application and workloads part, and then at the end of it is your data. Here, assuming there is no implicit or explicit trusted zone in the networks, right? Identity-based authentication and authorization need to be enforced for all the connections, and access to infrastructure, data and services needs to be granted based on that authentication and authorization being successful. Machine-to-machine authentication and authorization also needs to be enforced, because more and more machine-to-machine communications are happening. If you look at a typical picture from human to non-human identity, for every single human identity, there are more than 50 non-human identities. So you can think about the ratio between human to non-human identity is significantly skewed in the favor of non-human identities. Risk profiles need to be generated in near real time for monitoring and assessment of both the users and device behaviors. What we mean by risk profiles is you need to ensure that you've done the baselining and you've identified a risk profile for both user behavior, both device behavior. A device behavior might tell you if it's a risky device, then you can only give them conditional access. Same way, if the user seems to be somebody who has a higher risk than normal user, you don't grant them access without having extra set of validation challenges which are put forth. All the sensitive data needs to be encrypted, both while in transit and at rest. All the events are to be continuously monitored, collected, stored and analyzed so that we can achieve compliance with and adherence to the security policy. Policy management and distribution needs to be centralized. So, several approaches for building zero trust architecture, right? Enhanced identity governance. I don't know if some of you are familiar with what identity governance does or not, but identity governance and administration is a key component of identity and access management, where you actually go through your lifecycle management, you go through your provisioning, deprovisioning process, you go through user access certifications. So all those things are a part of your identity governance process. So you start developing your IGA in accordance with your overall IAM framework that you may have deployed in your organization, but IGA also will help you align that with the zero trust and give you that governance layer which you need to achieve. So ZTA stands for Zero Trust Architecture, that uses identity as the key component. So if you looked at the slide here, we talked about identity as a key pillar in your zero trust framework. Microsegmentation, which is where we are going to spend more time focusing on. So ZTA can be developed by isolating assets in unique network segments so that you can effectively secure every resource and thus dynamically grant access to the individual requests. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with segmentation of a network, right? ZTA actually goes further down. It goes much granular and it goes on to create what we call it as a microsegmentation. And last thing is network infrastructure and software defined perimeters. So you can leverage your network infrastructure to define the boundaries, the perimeters using this software, right? So microsegmentation divides the network into smaller isolated segments, and each of them is kind of functioning as an independent security zone. So these segments are microsegments. As I mentioned earlier, they're granular. They could be as granular as individual machines, applications, or workloads. The goal is to reduce the attack surface. And I don't know if some of you are familiar with the word attack surface or not, but attack surface is your exposure that you have to the potential attack, the part of your infrastructure that gets exposed, and it is somewhat susceptible to the attack. So that's the reason we have an attack surface. And you need to contain your potential breaches by ensuring if one segment gets compromised, attackers are not able to move laterally across the network. You might be wondering why so much? Because that way you are putting the boundaries so that others are not able to move laterally. One of the biggest things that happens in an attack or a breach is somebody gets access to a network and then they are able to traverse across the network and get more leeway by jumping over from one spot to other spot and trying to get higher privileges while staying inside the network. So by doing microsegmentation, you are basically taking out that approach where somebody would be able to come in and...
Excuse me, Tejas.
Yes,
sorry to interrupt. I think your video is not on. Can you please switch it on?
Trying to see where is the camera. Are you able to see?
Yes, now your camera is visible.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened, but yeah. So microsegmentation will slice and dice your network into smaller segments, as low as having a single machine or a single workload. And this will ensure that you're not able to move across the network if the need be. One of the biggest problems, as I was mentioning before the video thing happened, is the attackers typically get access to the open hole within the network. They get inside the network and then they try to get elevated privileges by moving across the network. And that is what we need to try and stop. So microsegmentation is very critical in today's cybersecurity landscape because obviously it bolsters and significantly enhances your network defenses by reducing the attack surface. Even if one of the machine gets compromised, right, because of the microsegmentation, you're not able to move and jump over to another node within the network. So by isolating each segment, you're preventing attackers from moving laterally. You cannot allow them to move freely across the network. So you're basically containing potential breach from acquiring significance, right? If somebody is going to go bigger and acquire significance by isolating that particular machine as a part of microsegmentation. You're restricting access. So this approach not only minimizes the impact of a successful attack, but you can even isolate by detecting a suspicious activity, because if you found out that something has happened in a particular confined area and that's what your monitoring says, then you know that that particular area is affected, and immediately what you do is you go ahead and kind of quarantine that area, isolate that portion from the network, and the rest of the network will not be affected. So microsegmentation obviously will take some time, because you have to set this up so that you are slicing and dicing your network in such a way. Now, somebody might have the question that if you do microsegmentation, can you still connect to other parts of the network? Yes, you can. But microsegmentation will still set it up in such a way so that you are not going to get into where you're freely able to jump from one node to another. So it's not like you're taking away the ability to communicate with the rest of the network. You're taking away the ability to freely move across the network. Cisco has gone a step further and created something called as universal ZTNA, which is kind of a upgrade on regular ZTNA. So Cisco, and we all know Cisco, right? Very few companies know network as good as Cisco. So Cisco has used their deep understanding of the network to power a secure in-office experience for users all across locations, applications, and devices. The solution gets delivered seamlessly through a single client, single console. Obviously, AI has to be splattered everywhere these days, so AI-driven architecture for fast and reliable yet secure application access to authorized users wherever the resources reside. You ensure a frictionless experience for remote user, which are increasing by the day. Actually, now it's even reducing because a lot of companies are forcing people to come back. But there are still remote users because the hybrid models are still kicking in. So you need users both to work from inside the building and hybrid. And remote users allows them to work productively. So universal ZTNA is a convergence of network and security for zero trust everywhere. ZTNA protects the remote user to private app access. Universal ZTNA covers all aspects of access for all users and IoT devices everywhere. So universal ZTNA has a much larger scope than a regular ZTNA, which was focusing on primarily countering the VPN. So if anyone understands the difference, or if anyone wants to know, we can possibly talk a little bit later. But universal ZTNA is focusing to cover all devices, all access is for all users, while ZTNA, core ZTNA was focusing on the VPN. This is your Cisco ZTNA, where you have your hybrid and remote users trying to access, you have your managed and unmanaged devices, your IoT devices, you have your World Wide Web, you have your cloud applications, and you're having your private apps. These are all connecting through this evolving perimeter and ensuring that you get the ZTNA access. These are some of the use cases and benefits of microsegmentation, right? By doing microsegmentation, you are segmenting your networks, you're slicing it, you're applying MFA. If you look at this, there is a zero trust servers. You have your hybrid workers that you're connecting. Customer is using the identity and access management solution. They have existing IDPs that they're playing with. So your zero networks is communicating with, and Zero Networks is a company which is actually providing microsegmentation services as well. So you're integrating with your existing IDP. Your secure cloud connection is interfacing. Your data is getting exchanged with your existing SOC and SIEM solutions to achieve even some of the SOAR functionalities. You also interface with your customers on-prem. And all of this, at the heart of it, is your zero trust environment that you're building out. So zero trust network access. How can microsegmentation help with compliance and security policies? Like, microsegmentation makes it easier to meet compliance requirements for frameworks like PCI DSS, HIPAA, SOC 2. Because of microsegmentation, you are able to provide detailed audit trails. You know if a particular access control happened, where did that happen? Because now you have each of those devices as a part of your segmented things. So, obviously, compliance and security policies, we all know, right, how critical they are. So, compliance and security policies are extremely critical. Audit is something which will continuously check. So, having audit trails will definitely help, right? If you have a microsegmented machine, or a machine on a microsegmented network, then you'll be able to provide the access audit trails in a much better manner. You don't have to work with the entire segment where it could be multiple devices and then you have to decipher which was the device which had the access control issues. So yes, here the audits will be simplified. What is the difference between your microsegmentation and a traditional network segmentation? Traditional segmentation focuses on the broader divisions, which is like you do a client versus server. Well, microsegmentation basically creates much smaller and much more precise segments. So obviously the access controls do get much better. The risk of unauthorized movement goes down significantly. You are not allowing devices to freely move across the network, right? So, if somebody may recall from the previous discussions or whatever they've seen, what does Zero Trust do? Zero Trust is making sure that you're not moving without any checks and balances across the network, right? Every time you go, you have to continuously authenticate yourselves, authorize yourselves just to make sure that you are who you are saying you are, right? You don't want somebody to go inside the network, one time you authenticate, and once you have authenticated, you're free to move for the entire day. Let's take an example of, say, if you're in a university or if you're in an office building. You entered once, but that doesn't give you access to move around freely, right? Even though you accessed using your access card, you got inside the building. But now what? You still have to make sure you prove that you have the access. in case of companies, a lot of times there have been instances where somebody did not have a badge. If you let someone in, and then the person goes in, and then you find out that that person was terminated, his access was taken away. Now you have allowed somebody to go inside the building without having the access, and that is why, especially companies are enforcing that nobody is tailgating, for instance. If you have, like if you're standing and if you have somebody who comes and says, I don't have my badge, what would you do? Will you allow them to go inside? Will you ask them to go to the security? And if you do that, I'll ask you another question. What if that person is your boss? What if that person is the CEO of the company? What would you do? You would ask them to go get their security checked. Now that may not go down well with your leader. That may not go down with an executive, right? So yes, it's a tough call, but is that an ethical call? Yes. Sometimes you're actually risking the repercussions by having somebody go in and say, hey, you have to go and authenticate yourselves. In case of microsegmentation, it's like you go into a building, but everyone has their own access, unique code. So if you forget your thing, you might have some other way to uniquely authenticate yourselves. Maybe it's your face ID. We are not there yet, but we are going towards where everyone's ID, face ID, because you may forget your phone, you may forget your wallet, you may forget your other things, right? But you're not going to forget your face. So your face can be used down the road as an authenticator, right? Your eyes, your face, your fingerprints, these are the things which you'll typically carry with you, right? Unless some of you know of some ways to separate out keeping your face or eyes or fingerprint at home when you go to office. You may forget your wallet, you won't forget the biometrics. So pretty soon microsegmentation will get more and more where your authentication is going to start happening with on microsegmented network along with your biometric. So does microsegmentation help with the movement of threats? Absolutely does. Because by doing microsegmentation, you're trying to stop the lateral movement from happening, right? That is the easiest way for attackers to spread within a network. More than 85% of the attackers work off of stolen privileges. When you work off of stolen privileges, you work off of elevated privileges. What you are doing is you're ensuring that once you get inside the network, others are able to allow you to get that elevated privilege by doing the lateral movement. And that lateral movement should be stopped. So you isolate each segment, you enforce strict controls so the threats do not propagate beyond the initial breach. Most important thing to do is threats are not able to move forward. So, how do you create a zero trust network? So, zero trust network is more of a principle thing. You are relying less on a specific hardware, but more on the approach to security. Right? You don't need special hardware for that. You need the mindset which will create a zero trust network, which is where a lot of people fail. They try to look for a good, like in everything, they try to look for, what tool do I use for zero trust? No, it's more about following a particular process, right? You need to identify your assets. A lot of times, you have to do your inventory of assets and make assessments about proprietary data and intellectual property. One of the things which I always discuss in my class, as actually my first class thing, I always ask my students that if your house is on fire, you have 10 minutes and you have to take 5 things with you which are priceless. What are those 5 things that you will take with you. It's important. You may laugh at this question, but why is it important? Because sometimes we don't know what we have. And one of the biggest problems with the world of security is, if you don't know what you have, how are you going to protect that? Right? Even if you look at CIS, Center for Information Security, their top 1 and 2 controls talk about knowing what you have, knowing what hardware you have, knowing what software you have. A lot of times we have some softwares, but we are not using them and yet paying maintenance revenue for it. Maintenance for that. There are hardware which are lying idle, but they are still connected onto the network. That means they are not patched and they are vulnerable bodies sitting on the network. So obviously that's where, if you have micro-segmented, at least even if somebody were to get access to that asset, they won't be able to go deeper into it. But if you have not isolated them through the network microsegmentation, then the chances are you could be on the actual network, and you may give that, through an unpatched system, an ability for somebody to laterally move across the network. So that's why microsegmentation is much better than traditional network segmentation. You have to verify your devices and users. A lot of people now try to come in through an unauthorized device. Now, if your device is not registered, there's a good chance you may be denied access. Your users and devices have to be verified, and device verification is one of the important factors that you have to get it verified. You're only coming in through an authorized device. A lot of times we have an option where it says, okay, you authorize the device, now for next 2 weeks, next 4 weeks, we will not ask you to authenticate again through this device, as long as you're coming through this trusted device, right? Device gains trust by passing the zero trust challenge, right? If not, then you have to go through the trust challenge again, right? And every time you have to do that, it adds time. It takes away the automation which you can do to freely move across the network. You need to know who can access what assets. When do you need to access them? How and why they should be granted the access. For a security person, why somebody should be granted access is a very important question. If I say that I need to get access to certain things, I need to be able to prove why I need that access. Not because my classmates or my teammates have the access. I need to have the access because I need to be able to justify why I need that particular access. So your security administrators need to define who needs to access what assets, when they should access them. So one of the things with microsegmentation would come in is, if you know that certain people need to have the access to the assets, that particular segment on the network, the micro segment on the network, has to be reachable for these people who need to access those assets. You need to define and automate your policies, right? You can use your assessment results to define policies for authentication, including what metadata needs to be covered. Obviously, these processes can be automated with next generation firewalls. Test, monitor, and maintain. A zero trust approach like threat modeling requires testing to ensure that impact on productivity is minimal and hypothetical security threats. Threat modeling is something which you do when you are about 70% or so confirm with your design. You identify what could be the threats and you try to put controls around it, which could be compensating controls, which could be preventive, corrective, detective controls to make sure that you are able to address those threats and you can nip them before they become big. So zero trust approach will definitely help you by looking at the threats in a holistic manner, and it will allow you to look for something which will say, hey, I have identified XYZ threats and these threats need to be addressed, and threat modeling will help you address those threats. So going back to identify assets, verify devices and users, map the workflows to define who has the access, defining and automating the policies, and testing, monitoring and maintaining an approach like threat modeling. So if somebody asks questions on threat modeling, I'll be glad to even answer those. But threat modeling is an exercise you need to do proactively to make sure you're able to look through and identify what are the potential threats. Are there any controls which will allow the threats to be lowered into their severity, or do you have to deal with particular threats as a whole? So threat modeling is a great approach which will help you determine what is the impact on your productivity. What are your hypothetical security threat scenarios that you need to counter? See, without microsegmentation, how are you going to control the movement? Because the other way is to lock down every single device or so. So some sort of access control, either from the network, which is more like the physical, or the logical, where you actually do not grant the access to anything logically. And those are the only two ways to pretty much lock down the access for somebody. So microsegmentation is one, other one is locking down on the logical access control. It's always going to be a balance, right? The user experience people are always going to have the argument that by doing zero trust, you are defeating the user experience. A lot of time they'll even may use the thing saying, oh, we are not getting enough business because customers are feeling the pain. So it's about education. It's about telling them that zero trust is necessary. And actually, the biggest way to do that is get the buy-in from the user experience people so that you can try and come up with a solution where user experience is still retained to an extent while enforcing zero trust. And that fine balance is definitely needed. But that's needed between anything which you have security and zero trust, security and user experience, right? They are the two sides of the same coin. There's a very seldom chance that they'll both work at the same time. Means if your user experience is improved, your security is getting compromised, or vice versa. So it's always going to be that fine balance that you will have to retain to see, do I do zero trust? Do I deal with zero like user experience, or I improve my security? So that's always going to be a challenge. You can audit or review by making sure what you have implemented. You will need to go through your audit trails to see if there has been anywhere you have seen your zero trust principle not been followed. The periodic testing will definitely help. You go through the workflow testing, just make sure that yes, this is something we've gone through, and these are the challenges we faced and the zero trust principles were not violated. So that particular level of testing is definitely required, right? So and periodically you should be having the audit, and that does not apply just to the zero trust, that applies to everything. So yeah, lot of times people think that security is one and a done thing. You do it one time and you forget all about it. No, it's not true. It requires continuous monitoring, right? Role of SOC 2 in ZTNA architecture, I don't know if there is a direct role. It's more about the compliance. ZTNA helps ensure you achieve your compliance with SOC 2, you achieve your compliance with HIPAA, PCI DSS, and the other frameworks. So there's no direct role of SOC 2 in a ZTNA architecture, but it's more of a derived role where ZTNA helps achieve that SOC 2 compliance. I don't think you can like start by saying it has to be an end-to-end. So all the 5 pillars is something that you look at. You cannot say that I'll only do one pillar first and then see if that is completely certified, then I'll go to the next one. No, because when you're doing, right, your identity, your device, your network, all is coming in at the same time. So you have to actually take it as a holistic. Out of those 5 pillars, if all your 5 pillars are implemented, then you have to look at all 5 pillars at once. You cannot say that I'll only do identity first. Once identity is complete, then I'll go to devices. No, that's not how it will work. Is a likelihood case of ZTNA compromise because ZTNA, for instance, is again more of a framework. It's more of a process, right? It's not like a product that you are implementing, right? So if you have missed some things, then yes, obviously there could be a potential compromise which could happen. But at the same time, what you really need to do is you have to make sure you're testing it, and that's where the audit trails will help you to make sure that you're passing the test on a regular basis. Right. It's like you going and saying, right, when that I have protected myself from a theft, right, by putting a lock on my home, right? I put certain locks so my home is protected. Now, how are you going to quantify that and say, oh, if somebody had come and robbed me, right, they would have taken X, Y, Z assets, and that would have cost me something. So security, sometimes you cannot quantify because uh, it's not a tangible thing that you can always say that, okay, this is what I would lose. Unless you have lost that, then you know it. But if you have not lost it, to put maturity and saying that I'm quantifying it is not going to help you. It's actually not easily possible to even go and quantify something. As I mentioned, right, we've taken the example of PCI, HIPAA, and SOC 2, but you can do it with even the ones which you just mentioned, GDPR. GDPR is again not as much onto the zero trust part. It's about the data aspect of it, where the 5th pillar data is actually going to be focusing more onto the GDPR part. Now your data needs to be protected, it needs to be encrypted. So these are some of the measures that you do. Again, going back to the fundamental principle of defense in depth, right? You are implementing this defense in depth so that you know for a fact that if one challenge fails, you can actually try to rectify it, right? So that's why you have defense in depth, and that is something which you'll have to do going forward. GDPR is talking about privacy. Now, privacy is more of a derived use case from security, because if you put your data in a secure manner, so if somebody even gets access to it, your privacy is not affected. But on the other side, when you're designing your system, you want to make sure that privacy is factored in and you're doing privacy by default. Measures which you have to take to try and modernize some of the older systems are not able to implement on ZTNA, then the choice comes from the architecture point of view. Do you really try and persist with that older architecture? How critical is that piece within the overall architecture puzzle? Can you live without that? Can you look at modernizing that particular system within the architecture, the legacy system? So those are the things which you need to measure to see if zero trust, if that is something which is not a non-critical thing, then maybe you do not enforce it as much. But if it's on a critical system, we need to take measures to migrate it away onto a more robust system. Zero trust data access is where you are actually making sure that your data that you're accessing is adhering to the zero trust principles, right? Because zero trust, but if your zero trust is a part, like how you have zero trust network access, like if I go to the 5 pillars, right? You had identity, you had networks. So ZTNA is zero trust network access, same way ZTDA is the zero trust data access. I would just say that continue to explore. Don't think that zero trust is a product. Zero trust is a mindset. It's more of a something that you have to do in terms of implementing it. First, you have to believe what you're trying to solve the problem with zero trust, right? What you're trying to do is zero trust is helping you achieve that secure state of mind. That when you implement zero trust, you're ensuring that even see a lot of people have objections being challenged that yeah I just gave. I'll give you a very simple thing to think about, and this is something maybe Shilpa we can address in our next thing is see on one hand we had implemented single sign-on in the old when I say old probably 15-20 years back single sign-on was way to go and everyone is doing single sign-on to make sure that your user experience is smooth and you don't have to log in multiple times. But now I'm coming in and saying zero trust, where even if you have authenticated every time, right? I'm asking you to validate yourselves again and again. So the core user experience people are not going to be too happy to see that because they're going to think that, hey, why am I asked to authenticate again? But now the security has become so critical that we definitely need to make sure that we have done our due diligence and we have protected ourselves from all sorts of outside threats. You don't know where the threat is emanating from. So you're protecting yourselves from those threats. And hence, zero trust framework is becoming more and more critical. User experience people will definitely feel that by you challenging them. So that's the reason you have to work with user experience people to make sure that user experience is not defeated as much, but security is strengthened. So they have to work together and we need to work together to achieve that aspect.